In 2001 and 2002, a survey team walked a 5-mile barrier island in southern New Jersey and counted 307 motels, 11 retail structures, and one government building. It was the largest surviving collection of mid-20th century resort architecture in the United States, and no other American town held anything close to it. By February 2018, 121 of those 319 structures had been demolished. More than a third of the inventory, gone in roughly 16 years. The town that lost them was not dying. Direct tourism spending through August of 2024 ran past $374 million, a record on top of the previous year's record. A resort was breaking its own records while taking itself apart, and the explanation begins with the ground the building stood on. Towns shed architecture on that scale for familiar reasons. The work leaves and the people follow, and the emptied buildings come down after them. None of that happened here. The visitors kept coming, and the money kept growing, and the town functioned through every season of the demolition. The buildings did not burn and did not wash away. They were taken down on purpose, permit by permit, in the middle of the best run of seasons the island had ever recorded. They did not fall out of use so much as out of the arithmetic. What removed them was not decline, but value. That inversion, a town's success driving the destruction of the town's fabric, is uncommon enough that it took years for anyone to see it happening. And to understand how, the place to start is the sand itself. The ground is a barrier island called 5 Mile Beach at the southern end of the New Jersey shore in Cape May County. 5 miles of sand lie between the Atlantic Ocean on the east and the Back Bays and Salt Marsh on the west, and that narrow strip carries 4 separate municipalities: North Wildwood, Wildwood, Wildwood Crest, and West Wildwood. 4 governments for 5 miles of sand, and the sand is close to all any of them has to govern. Philadelphia sits roughly 90 miles away by road, and that one measurement decided who the island's customers would be for a century. A shore resort belongs in practice to whichever city can reach it, and the city that could reach 5 Mile Beach was Philadelphia. For the next 100 years, the island's fortunes would move with decisions made 90 miles inland. What its people earned and how they chose to travel, none of those decisions would ever be made on the island itself. That detail sits underneath everything that follows. The island has one property that separates it from most resort ground on the Atlantic seaboard. It has been getting physically larger. Currents and the inlet at the north end pile sand onto the beach faster than the ocean takes it away. So the beach widens, without anyone paying for it or asking it to, season after season, in a business where beach is the entire inventory. On a resort island, sand is acreage, and the acreage kept increasing. The result is one of the widest beaches on the Atlantic coast, wide enough that the walk from the boardwalk to the waterline is measured in hundreds of yards. The distance is not an inconvenience so much as a ledger. Most of those yards are ground the ocean added after the boards went down. A trackless tram runs along the boardwalk to cover distances like that. And the cars themselves are older than nearly every building they roll past. They debuted at the New York World's Fair of 1939 and were bought for the boardwalk in 1949. The raw material of the resort arrived free of charge, and it never stopped arriving. Everything the island built, it built on land the ocean had made. The land came free. The land kept coming. And the land, in the end, would be worth more than anything standing on it. Buildings begin aging the day they open. Sand does not. That is the thesis of this story. The ground underneath the resort gaining value quietly, decade over decade, while whatever stood on top of it grew old. Every fortune that follows, the founders, the motel builders, the developers who came after them, was, at bottom, a position in that ground. The building started in 1895. That year, three merchant brothers from the farm town of Vineland, Latimer Baker, Philip Baker, and J. Thompson Baker, formed the Wildwood Beach Improvement Company, a name that promised exactly what the enterprise intended: a beach improved. Improvement, in the vocabulary of the age, meant that land which could not yet be sold would be made ready to sell. It was a common kind of enterprise for the era, and an unusually honest name. The Bakers were not speculators working from a map in an office somewhere. They had visited 5 Mile Beach before committing, and the island they kept returning to already had a settlement on it at Holly Beach. The tract they bought lay to its north. What stood on that tract was forest, a forest standing in the sea. And the brothers put the fact straight into the name, Wildwood. The borough was incorporated the same year, so 1895 covers the company, the name, and the municipality all at once. The first tract succeeded, and the success pushed the Bakers south into Dune and Thicket. And the Dune and Thicket became, in time, Wildwood Crest. The crest was not an afterthought. It was the same bet placed a second time, farther down the island. Merchants from a farm town had bought wood standing in the ocean and sold them as a future, and enough people believed them to make the future arrive. That was 131 years ago. The names the Bakers wrote on the map are still on it. In 1899, construction began on the first stretch of what would grow into the Wildwood Boardwalk, and with it, the island acquired its two fixed points: the tracks that brought the guests and the boards the guests came for. Rail and trolley service delivered Philadelphia's working families to the island by the trainload. Arrival was collective, scheduled, and seasonal. Between those 2 points, the first resort economy took its shape. It was an economy of boarding houses and large wooden hotels, all of them within walking distance of the boardwalk, because the guests arrived without cars and stayed 2 weeks. Both halves of that sentence carried the entire design. A family that steps off a train owns no wheels for the rest of its stay, so everything it will pay for has to sit inside the radius of a walk. Which is why the hotels crowded toward the boards, and why proximity to the boards was worth more than anything else a property could offer. And a family that settles in for 2 weeks fills a large building slowly and steadily, all season long, which is exactly what the big wooden hotels were built to do. The pieces fit one another precisely. It was a resort calibrated to the railroad the way a mill town is calibrated to its river. Take away the river, and the mill stops, and the island's river was the railroad. It set the schedule, and walking distance drew the map. Every hotel and boarding house on the island was positioned for a guest who came by rail, moved on foot, and stayed for 2 weeks, because that was the only guest the island had ever known. The arrangement held for decade after decade, through every kind of summer, and nothing arrived to test it. Nothing in the era of the trainload suggested the guest would ever change. The Bakers had incorporated their borough in 1895, and the shape the island settled into would hold for 57 years. What finally broke it did not come by train. It came by road. The war ended. The automobile arrived in the driveways of the same Philadelphia families the trains had always carried, and the guest the island had spent its whole history serving quietly turned into someone else. A family that arrives by car wants to park the car, to reach the pool, and to reach the sand, without walking through a hotel lobby to do any of it. That sounds like a modest demand, a matter of doors and pavement. It is in fact a complete specification for a building, dictated from the driver's seat, and it describes a building that did not exist anywhere on the island. The demand was never stated anywhere, and it did not need to be. It was expressed the way market demands are always expressed, in where the cars stopped and where they did not. The rail-era hotel could offer none of it, and the island's building stock was rail-era from one end of the boardwalk to the other. The shape that had held for 57 years was now precisely the wrong shape. Every room on 5 Mile Beach had been built for a customer who was ceasing to exist, and the customer replacing him was already parked outside. The first building shaped for the new customer opened in 1952. It was called Jay's Motel. It was the first motel on the island, and it was put up by two brothers named Morey. Louis J. Morey was known as Lou. Wilbert C. Morey was known as Will. They were builders, not architects, and the distinction is worth holding on to because it is the origin of everything the island was about to become. An architect would have brought a theory to the island. The Moreys brought a trade. A motel in 1952 was still a new kind of building, a hotel reorganized around the automobile, with the room, the pool, and the parked car brought within a few steps of one another. And the island had never seen one before. Jay's gave the driver what the old hotels could not. Their formal partnership ran until 1955, and when it ended, neither man left the business. Each simply went on building without the other. Between them, first as partners and then separately, they would put up a large share of all the motel stock the island ever carried. Whatever 5 Mile Beach came to look like, a remarkable amount of it was the work of two brothers building on their own accounts, one summer at a time. What multiplied after Jay's had no architects in it and no design theory behind it. The buildings were the work of contractors, and the contractors were competing for the attention of exactly one judge, a driver moving past at 25 miles an hour. A judge like that never sees a floor plan and never reads a review. He sees whatever can reach him through a windshield at that speed. And so the competition was fought with the things that could: neon, colored panels, angled roofs, boomerangs, starbursts, and themes taken from places the paying guests would never actually visit. 25 miles an hour was the design constraint, the client brief, and the entire theory of the facade. Every new motel had to out-signal the one built the summer before, because the one built the summer before was still out there, renting rooms on the same avenue. The escalation was not a side effect of the design process. It was the entire design process. The contest had no jury and no prize except occupancy. Nobody on the island was composing a movement. Everybody was trying to be seen from a moving car. And a style is simply what that looks like after enough summers of trying. In 1957, Lou Morey built the Caribbean Motel at 5600 Ocean Avenue in Wildwood Crest, ground that had been dune and thicket when the Bakers pushed south from their first tract. The Caribbean had a crescent-shaped swimming pool and canted glass walls, and a levitating ramp ran along the front of the building. It was also the first motel in the Wildwoods to install full-size plastic palm trees, and the palms were not decoration in any ordinary sense. They were signal, the theme itself planted at the curb, aimed at the road like everything else on the property. What happened to them is the island's whole competitive logic in miniature. Within a few seasons, plastic palms stood outside half the motels on the island. The astonishment of one summer had become the standard equipment of the next, which meant the following summer would require a new astonishment, which meant the escalation now had no natural stopping point. The same year the Caribbean opened, so did a motel, called the Ebb Tide, and the Ebb Tide is generally counted as the first true Doo-Wop motel ever built on 5 Mile Beach. 2 buildings, 1 year, and between them the vocabulary of the decade that followed. Then the island stopped adding motels one at a time. Between 1956 and 1964, more than 200 of them went up on 5 Mile Beach. 8 years on an island 5 miles long, more than 25 new motels a year. A resort that had spent half a century accumulating one kind of lodging replaced its entire idea of the business in 8. Nothing about that pace was coordinated, and no one was in charge of it. The same competition that designed the buildings also scheduled them. 12 years after Jay's opened, the boom it had started was complete. The names alone are a map of what was being sold. The Waikiki, the Tangiers, the Konakai, the Satellite, the Jolly Roger, the Pan American, the Bel Air, the Aruba, the Yankee Clipper. None of the names had anything to do with New Jersey, and that was the point. The tropics, the space age, the open sea, places most of the guests would never see. Rentable by the night with parking outside the door. A working family from Philadelphia could not reach the Pacific, but it could drive to the Waikiki, and the Waikiki was 90 miles away. The boom recorded itself in the street grid. The earliest motels sat on the west side of Ocean Avenue. But the ocean kept doing what it had been doing, and as new ground accumulated on the seaward side, new motels followed it, rising on the east side of Ocean Avenue, on lots that had not existed a generation earlier. By the end of the boom, Ocean Avenue had motels on both sides. Consider what that means. Most towns build toward their water and stop when they reach it. This one built toward its water, and the water backed away and left more land. The newest buildings stood on the newest ground, and the ground was still coming. Builders in most places have to fight for land. On 5 Mile Beach, the land arrived on its own, season after season, and the motels walked out to meet it. Between 2001 and 2006, close to 100 of these buildings were demolished. 5 years. The ebb tide, the first of them all, came down in 2003, 46 years after it opened. Of the 319 structures documented in the survey of 2001 and 2002, 121 were gone by February 2018, more than a third of everything that had been counted. 43 of the buildings left standing had been gutted and converted into condominiums. The Satellite, the Konakai, the Waterways, the Fantasy, the Rio, the Sea Rose, the Sand Castle, demolished, all of them. But that is 40 years ahead of the story, and from where the story now stands, in the middle of the boom, none of it is visible. The wrecking crews belong to another century, and so do the reasons they came. Before any of that can mean anything, you have to see the island at its loudest. The summers when the neon was new, the plastic palms were multiplying down Ocean Avenue, and the motels were filling as fast as they could be built. Because something else had arrived on the island along with the automobile, and it did not come to build. It came to sing. The singing had a date and an address. In 1954, Bill Haley and his Comets worked a club on the island called the Hofbrau, and in April of that same year, in a New York recording studio, the band cut Rock Around the Clock. Wildwood has claimed ever since that the song was launched from the Hofbrau's stage. The record was made in New York. The launch is a story the town tells about itself, and it has never stopped telling it. The distinction matters less than the fact underneath it, which needs no defending. In the year that record was made, Maus Skankin Station Samara Roldu, the men who made it were playing a bar on 5 Mile Beach. The loudest act in America was working the same island where the motels were multiplying, and the two booms had found each other. The music did not pass through on its way to somewhere bigger. In 1956, a Philadelphia disc jockey named Bob Horn brought American Bandstand to Wildwood for the summer. In 1957, Dick Clark broadcast the show live on national television from the Starlight Ballroom. American Bandstand was a Philadelphia program the way the island was a Philadelphia resort, and when the show moved to the shore for the season, it was following the same families down the same 90 miles of road, but a live national broadcast reversed the island's oldest current. The road from Philadelphia had always moved people in one direction. Now the island was transmitting back. A teenager anywhere in the country could switch on a television and watch a program coming out of Wildwood, New Jersey. The town was no longer only a place Philadelphia went in the summer. It had become a place the country heard from. In the summer of 1960, an 18-year-old named Chubby Checker headlined the Rainbow Club at the corner of Pacific and Spicer Avenues. The song at the center of his act was The Twist, and the record on that point is worth keeping straight. Checker did not write it and did not invent it in Wildwood. It was a Hank Ballard song from 1959. What Wildwood supplied was the room. It was there at Pacific and Spicer that the song went into motion and started toward the rest of the country, carried by a teenager singing at a shore club to an audience of other teenagers on vacation. In 1963, Bobby Rydell recorded Wildwood Days, and the island crossed a line few resorts ever cross. It stopped being a place that booked the music and became the subject of it. An island of motels was now a song on national radio. For roughly a decade, the town was the summer address of American teenage popular music, and the arrangement was not sentimental on either side. The music drew the crowds. The motels were built to hold the audience. The clubs filled the evenings. The piers filled the days. On May 30th, 1957, Memorial Day, the rebuilt Hunts Pier opened with 4 rides, and by its grand opening on June 21st, it carried 10. The escalation that governed the motels governed the piers as well. Whatever drew a crowd one summer had to be exceeded the next. In the spring of 1960 came the ride the island would be known by, the Golden Nugget Mine Ride, part dark ride and part steel coaster, built for Hunts Pier by Philadelphia Toboggan Coasters and engineered by John C. Allen. Alongside it ran the Flyer, a wooden coaster 36 feet tall with a ride time of 59 seconds. Modest dimensions, an outsized function. A beach fills a resort on the weekend, and the weather decides the rest of the week. A pier full of rides is an argument for staying the extra night, and the extra night multiplied across an island of motels was the difference between a business and a gamble. A motel sells a bed. A pier sells the reason to keep it another day. The piers gave the motels a reason to be full on a Tuesday. The scale of what those summers filled is worth stating plainly. At the peak, the island held roughly 11,000 places to sleep. The 4 Wildwoods still swell from about 16,000 year-round residents to more than 250,000 people on a summer weekend, a multiplication of more than 15 times. Wildwood City itself holds a little over 5,000 people in February, and the entire municipal apparatus, police, water, roads, trash, is built for the summer number, not the winter one, because the summer number is the one that cannot be allowed to fail. A factory town at least keeps its people through the winter. This one watches its entire reason for existing drive back up the road at the end of every season. 10 weeks of full motels, 10 weeks of full piers, 10 weeks of 250,000 people on 5 miles of sand. Then the season ends, and machinery sized for 250,000 spends the winter serving 5,000. Imagine standing on the boardwalk in 1963. The tramcar rolling past is older than nearly every building it passes, because nearly every building it passes is new. To the east, the beach runs hundreds of yards before it finds the water. On ground, the ocean added without being asked. To the west stand the motels, with their angled roofs and boomerangs and starbursts, plastic palms at the curbs, and the neon of the Waikiki, and the Satellite, and the Bel Air signaling into the dark for drivers who have already parked. On Hunts Pier, the Flyer is somewhere in its 59-second circuit, and the Golden Nugget is running beside it. Behind you, Ocean Avenue carries motels on both of its sides, the newest of them standing on ground that did not exist a generation ago. The Starlight Ballroom nearby has already carried this boardwalk onto national television, and Wildwood Days is on the radio this summer. A hit song about the boards underfoot. An island the Bakers had found as forest standing in the sea is now, for 10 weeks a year, one of the loudest places on the Atlantic coast. Everything in sight is either brand new or filling up, and most of it is both. And through every one of those summers, the thing the island had built had no name. The men putting up the motels believed they were building motels, not a movement, and nobody wrote about them while they worked. No journal reviewed the buildings as they went up, and no movement claimed them. The name arrived in the early 1990s, when the Mid-Atlantic Center for the Arts in nearby Cape May began calling the style Doo-Wop, after the music that had filled the island's clubs. Elsewhere in the country, the same architecture answers to other names, Googie or Populux, but Wildwood's version was named last, and it was named by outsiders, an arts organization in a neighboring town, not anyone who had poured the concrete or wired the neon. The christening came roughly a decade before the demolition started. The men who invented the style never used the word. They had understood themselves, from the first summer to the last, to be in the motel business. By the time the style had a name, the island's loudest corner was already gone. Hunt's Pier was sold in 1985, 28 years after its Memorial Day opening. It ran through the end of the 1988 season, 31 years after those first 4 rides. And when that season closed, its custom-built attractions were demolished. The rides that had been designed for that pier and no other place went down with it. The Flyer's 59-second circuit ended for good. The Golden Nugget lasted longer. It came off the pier in early 2009. Trains, track, and machinery, all of it purchased by Noble's Amusement Resort, and trucked inland to Ellisburg, Pennsylvania, 49 years after its debut. About 2 years later, in October 2011, the ride opened again under a new name, Black Diamond. 51 years after its first season above the boards of Hunt's Pier, the machinery was running again, and it has been running ever since. The most famous ride the island ever had is still working. It works in another state. In 1969, the money that had built the island's motels began moving off the motel lots. Will Morey, the same Will who had opened Jay's Motel with his brother Lou in 1952 and had been putting up rooms across 5 Mile Beach ever since, joined his brother Bill in buying 2 boardwalk lots at 25th and 26th Streets in North Wildwood. And on that ground, the 2 men erected a fiberglass slide they called the Wipeout. This was not a new family arriving in a new business. It was the family that had built the rooms, concluding, in the plainest language capital speaks, that the next dollar did not belong in rooms. In 1952, the Moreys had read the automobile correctly before almost anyone else on the island. The slide was the same kind of reading, aimed at whatever was coming next. No announcement accompanied the shift. A slide went up on the boardwalk, and the island's most experienced builders had quietly moved to the other side of the ledger. The slide was 12 lanes across, 40 feet tall, and 200 feet long. A trip down it cost 25 cents and was taken sitting on a burlap sack. It was not architecture, and nothing about it asked to be looked at twice. It was built to be ridden, a quarter at a time, as many times in an afternoon as the line allowed. A motel tied its owner to a building, to rooms that had to fill night after night. The slide asked nothing of anyone beyond the next 25 cents. It ran for 43 years. On an island that was about to start losing buildings it had believed permanent, the burlap slide turned out to be one of the durable things. In 1976, the brothers bought the fire-damaged Marine Pier and renamed it Mariner's Landing. 12 rides came with the purchase. 7 of the 12 were thrown away. That ratio is worth pausing on because it is precisely the judgment the island's motel owners were not making in the same years. The willingness to look at something standing and paid for and decide it was finished. A ride that could not earn its space did not keep its space, even a ride someone had already paid for. The rides are the part of the family's work that is still the family's today. More than 100 attractions spread across 3 piers and 2 water parks. Capital that had once gone into rooms back in 1952 had now found the place where it could stay. Moving out of rooms was the family's answer to a question the rest of the island had not yet heard anyone ask. The question was arriving from multiple directions at once, and none of them was visible from the boardwalk. Affordable air travel came first. The island's oldest advantage had been reach. It was the vacation a Philadelphia family could get to. Cheap seats on an airplane dissolved that advantage without touching the island at all, putting Florida and the Caribbean inside the same family budget that had always belonged to the shore. Against beaches where the palm trees were not plastic, the island could offer what it had always offered, the same 8 weeks of weather. Nothing on 5 Mile Beach had failed. The competition had simply widened to include places the automobile could not reach, at prices the automobile's families could now pay. 5 Mile Beach was not losing customers to a better boardwalk. It was losing them to an airport. The vacation itself was shrinking at the same time. A 2-week seaside holiday contracted into the long weekend, and the long weekend is the wrong length of stay for a building with 60 rooms and a coffee shop. Every part of such a building assumes time. A guest settled in long enough to want breakfast where he sleeps, rooms that fill for a stretch of days, rather than turning over every Sunday. The long weekends starved the assumption, and by the end of the 1960s, the style itself had gone out of fashion. Angled roofs and starbursts stopped reading as futuristic and started reading as dated. The buildings had not changed a line. What had changed was the year in which they were being looked at. Then the state redrew the map. In 1976, New Jersey's voters approved casino gambling in Atlantic City, and 2 years later, in 1978, Resorts International opened the first casino, roughly 60 miles up the same coastline. 14 years after the island's motel boom had ended. Cape May County's tourism operators understood immediately what a legal casino 60 miles closer to Philadelphia would do to a family driving south. Some of them stopped trying to compete with it at all and began running bus trips to Atlantic City instead. The county's own operators, carrying the shore's own customers up the coast. It was a rational decision, and it moved money in exactly the wrong direction for an island of motels. Within a decade, Atlantic City was drawing more than 30 million visitors a year, a mass of traffic that pulled the center of the shore's gravity up the coast. Wildwood was no longer the reason anyone drove past it. Through the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, the motels aged in place, and they aged under their original owners. The people who had built or bought these buildings in their 20s and 30s were still working the front desk in their 60s. These buildings stayed open and stopped being renovated, a combination with only one destination, and the island acquired a reputation as the cheap end of the Jersey Shore. But the season kept working. Every summer, the rooms filled, the boardwalk ran, and the books closed well enough to open again the following spring. And because the season kept working, nothing forced a decision, and no decision was made. The buildings and their owners grew old together at the same front desk, waiting on nothing in particular. What would finally force a decision was not age, but the one asset under the island that had never stopped gaining value, and it had not yet named its price. The first organized defense arrived in 1997, and it arrived carrying a familiar name. The Doo-Wop Preservation League was founded that year, and its co-founder and president was Jack Morey. Third generation of the family that had built the motels in the first place. That first generation had put up the rooms, and then, in 1969, moved its capital out of them and into rides. The third was now organizing to save what remained of the rooms. This same family, earliest out of the buildings, produced the man leading the effort to keep them standing. Nobody planned that symmetry. It is simply what 3 generations of the same trade on the same 5 miles of sand look like when the sand outlasts the buildings. The League gave the style everything an endangered style can be given on paper. Architects Michael Hirsch, Richard Stokes, and Anthony Bracali wrote a design handbook titled How to Doo-Wop, setting out how new construction and renovation could keep the language, and the city of Wildwood adopted the handbook into its development ordinances. It had a name. It had an advocacy organization. It had a rule book with a municipality's signature on it. What it did not have, what none of the paper amounted to, was any power to stop a demolition permit. An owner who wanted a lot cleared still needed nothing but the permit, and the permit did not ask the league's opinion. So the league's era opened not with a rescue, but with a count. In 2001 and 2002, a cultural resource management firm called Arch 2, led by Nancy Zerbe, conducted the first complete survey of the island's motels that anyone had ever made, and conducted it without charge. The documentation fell to a summer intern named Stephanie Hoagland, who recorded the buildings one by one down the length of the island. Final count: 307 motels, 11 retail structures, 1 government building. The numbers this story opened with, assembled for the first time. Before that summer, no one had ever known exactly how much of the style existed, because no one had ever counted it. Now there was a list, and the list was completed at exactly the moment the things on it began to disappear. They began to disappear because the ground had finally named its price, and there is no villain in this part of the story. The owners had put up these motels in the 1950s and 1960s, or bought them soon after, and they were now in their 70s. They wanted to retire. There was no second generation willing to take the front desk. And underneath every one of the buildings sat the asset this story has been tracking since before the Bakers arrived: the land the ocean had made. A property bought for a few $100,000 was now worth millions as a building lot, because a 2-story motel on an ocean block is the least profitable thing that land can hold. The building could earn a season of room rents. The ground under it answered to a different market entirely. Every year the ocean widened the beach, the lots gained value. Every year the buildings grew older, they lost it. The two curves had been separating since the 1950s quietly, underneath the business, and by the turn of the century the distance between them had become the largest number on the island. Developers offered retirement in a single check. 40 summers behind a front desk could not match it, and nothing about the offer required the owner to be greedy or the buyer to be cynical. A man in his 70s, holding a building that had stopped being renovated decades earlier, was being offered millions of dollars to stop working. The alternative was to keep standing behind the desk of an aging building, in a business the vacation industry had been drifting away from for 30 years, and to hope the children changed their minds. Each sale was a sensible decision made by a person who had earned the right to make it, and the sum of the sensible decisions was the destruction of the style. Nobody chose that outcome. It was simply what the choices added up to. The defense moved at the speed paper moves. On April 8, 2003, a historic district nomination was submitted to the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office. On July 23, 2003, the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer, Dorothy Guzzo, found the proposed district eligible for the National Register under criteria A and C. The district as drawn ran 43 blocks, from East Topeka Avenue north to Andrews Avenue, between Atlantic Avenue and the beach. The dense heart of the boom, the ground where the motels had followed the new sand east across Ocean Avenue. On paper, the largest collection of mid-century resort architecture in America was about to be recognized as exactly that. It was the recognition the League had been working toward since its founding. 6 years of organizing distilled into a boundary on a map. The recognition would take 3 years to process. The selling did not pause while it did. The nomination did not survive its own processing time. By 2006, the boundaries had to be redrawn, cut by 20 blocks, because the blocks in the original drawing had lost their buildings while the papers moved. The people processing the nomination were not idle, and the people demolishing the motels were not racing the state. The two processes simply ran at their own speeds. And the natural speed of paperwork is measured in years, while the natural speed of demolition is measured in days. A historic district is drawn around what is standing, and a block whose motels are gone is not evidence of a style. It is a vacant lot. Each year the file described a district. Each year the district described by the file held fewer buildings. 20 of the 43 blocks came out of the map, and 23 remained. Then, before the end of 2006, the state office reached the conclusion the map had been pointing toward all along. The integrity of the area had fallen below the level a coherent historic district requires. The designation was abandoned. More than 50 motels were demolished between 2003 and 2006 alone. The same 3 years the nomination spent in process. The town had torn down enough of itself during the paperwork to disqualify the rest. Nobody defeated the nomination. Nobody argued against it. Nobody needed to. The owners kept selling. The buyers kept clearing. And the district evaporated block by block out from under its own application until the thing being nominated no longer met the definition of a thing. The collection was not overruled. It was outpaced. That same year, the National Trust for Historic Preservation placed the Wildwood motels on its list of America's 11 most endangered historic places. The listing carries no legal force whatsoever. It is a way of announcing that something is being lost, and by the end of 2006, the announcement was arriving after the fact. What survived? Survived by working. As of 2016, about 93 Doo-Wop motels were still operating as motels, refurbished, repainted, open for the season. Proof that the buildings had never stopped being able to earn their keep, only stopped being the highest use of their ground. Of the buildings left standing, 43 had been converted into condominiums, which keeps the shell and ends the motel. The roofline survives, and the business it was shaped for does not. A condominium keeps the architecture and retires it from the trade the architecture was invented to win. And in the entire history of the style, exactly 2 buildings were ever individually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. One was the Caribbean, Lou Morey's 1957 building at 5600 Ocean Avenue, with the crescent pool and the levitating ramp. The other was the Chateau Bleu, added on March 25, 2004, at 45 years old, younger than the 50 the register ordinarily looks for, an exception granted because the architecture was judged significant enough to justify it. Out of 8 years of building and half a century of running, the federal roll held 2 names. The Chateau Bleu stood at 911 Surf Avenue in North Wildwood, built in 1959 with a heart-shaped swimming pool. It had stood through the tear-down years that erased its neighbors, and it carried the strongest paper protection the style ever received. On March 19, 2025, its owner, a company called Surf Capital, LLC, presented a plan to replace it with 3 single-family homes, and the zoning board approved the plan by a vote of 7-2. In June of 2025, the equipment arrived, and within a week, the building was flat, and the lot was being cleared. North Wildwood has no local ordinance protecting such buildings, and a listing on the National Register has never carried the power to stop a private owner from taking one down. It is a recognition, not a shield. 66 years after it was built, 21 years after the federal government put it on the list, one of the 2 federally recognized examples of the style became 3 house lots. The arithmetic that had cleared Ocean Avenue did not read the register, it read the land. The island itself is doing better than it has in decades. Direct tourism spending from January through August of 2024 passed $374 million, a record, and 2023 had been the record before it. New hotels keep opening under new names. The Madison Resort in Wildwood Crest with 200 rooms, the Wild Resort, Mahalo Resorts, the Vibes Hotel. The formula the Bakers found in 1895, sand, and a city 90 miles up the road, is producing more money than it ever has. The island did not stop being a resort. It stopped being the resort the surveyors walked. The beach is still widening. The season still works. Only the buildings holding it are new. In Fox Park, in the middle of Wildwood, stands the Doo-Wop Experience, the Museum of the Style. The building is a survivor in the only form survival reliably took here. It was a restaurant in Wildwood Crest, saved from demolition, taken apart, and rebuilt on the new site. A building that exists because it agreed to stop existing where it stood. Out front stands the Neon Sign Garden, restored neon signs cut from motels that no longer exist, and lit every night. Each sign was built to be read from a moving car by a family deciding where to sleep, an argument for pulling over, aimed at the road. The signs still light. The buildings they argued for are gone, and the signs go on making the argument anyway, spelling out the names of motels that are now condominium parking. Every night in the park, the names come on.